Okay, welcome everybody. It's 3:30, so we'll get started. I want to let you know that the chat is disabled, but we do have the Q&A function available. So feel free to use that and ask questions at any point. We'll also save some time at the end for us to answer any of your questions. So you are here for Language Foundations for Literacy, and you'll see it is a panel discussion. We will introduce ourselves, share a little bit about the work that we do, but all of us are speech language pathologists working at the College of St. Rose. As a reminder, you received information about requesting a CTLE certificate. So if you do need a certificate of CTLE credit or a certificate of attendance, you can send an email to ctle@strose.edu. If you need that CTLE credit, be sure to include your first name, last name, and middle initial, your date of birth, and the last 4 digits of your social security number. That is a New York State Department of Education requirement. If you only need a certificate of attendance, then just your first and last name will be sufficient. So here is our agenda today. In our panel presentation, we will be discussing information about language and literacy with a focus on the 5 domains of language and how they provide a foundation for literacy learning. There were going to be 5 of us today. Unfortunately, one of our presenters, Dana Ardavini, could not be here today, so the 4 of us will be presenting. My name is Caitlin Carroll. I'm a speech language pathologist. I work here at the College of St. Rose. I do a combination of teaching and clinical supervision, and my area of interest and focus is speech sound disorders. Now we'll go down the panel and the rest of the panelists can introduce themselves.
Are we going up or are we just gonna stay here? Just stay here.
There is fine.
I'll just talk loud. Go ahead.
Okay. My name is Grace Pastor. I am a speech and language pathologist here at the college. I work in the clinic. I'm the coordinator of the clinic. Before that, I was working in schools, and a big area of interest of mine was reading and writing.
I'm Melissa Spring. I'm the director of clinical services here at the College of St. Rose, also a speech language pathologist. I have a couple areas of specialty, but one of my primary areas is language-based learning disabilities, including individuals with dyslexia and dysgraphia.
Hi, my name is Sally Ann Geis. I'm also a speech language pathologist and an assistant professor here at St. Rose. And my areas of interest are written language disorders and differential diagnosis of dyslexia and intervention for dyslexia.
So as you can see, we will be going through the 5 domains of language. You'll hear each of us come up to share a little bit about the connection between that domain and literacy, which will include speaking and listening, as well as reading and writing. As a reminder, you can use the Q&A form at the bottom to ask any questions along the way, and we will respond to those at the end. Our learning objectives today. First, we want you to be able to describe the reciprocal relationship between spoken language and reading and writing. We want you to be able to apply this information by listing strategies that can be implemented right in the classroom to support students' access to the academic curriculum. We really hope that you can take something from today and apply it with your students immediately. And finally, adapt. We're hoping that you can adapt these strategies to support your multilingual learners in the classroom as well. So first, Melissa Spring will come up to discuss phonology.
Hey, I'm happy to be first. I also think I got the easiest area. So we'll go through what phonology is. So when we think about phonology, what you should be thinking about is phonology as the study of sounds. And when we're talking about speech production and reading and spelling, we're talking about individual speech sounds. So those speech sounds are really the foundation of both spoken and written language, right? And so if we think about the 4 domains of listening, speaking, reading, and writing, from a listening perspective, it's very important that students be able to distinguish the differences between each speech sound, understanding that, the B is different than an I, and how those changes in sounds can impact the words they're reading, the words they're spelling, and the words that they are saying. So one of the ways that you can think about this as a classroom teacher is the phonological awareness tasks that you might be doing with students, including segmenting words into their component sounds, blending sounds together to create a word, manipulating those sounds, substituting, saying the word cat, but then saying it with a b instead of a k, and making the word bat. Those are all listening oriented, phonologically based tasks. When we think about speaking, as speech language pathologists, we focus a lot on phonological development of speech. What does that mean? Well, the process of learning to be an effective oral communicator has a lot to do with understanding phonological patterns, that words have beginnings, words have ending sounds. Some sounds have voice, some sounds don't. Some sounds require continuous airflow, like the SH, shh, right? And some sounds don't. We stop sound and let it out. So that is how speaking develops with these sort of larger concepts. Reading, obviously, is phonics based, right? Based in phonology, based on sounds of our spoken language. And so being able to decode words has a lot to do with looking at a word, especially if that word is unfamiliar, and noticing the letters and being able to associate the sounds that go with those letters so that you can figure out what the word is that's on the page. And then in writing and spelling, it's the reverse. It's thinking about the sound of the sounds of the words that you want to write, and then associating that grapheme or printed letter with that phoneme to write it down on the page and then check your work. So you can see how all of those skills work together and are based on this building block of a sound, a speech sound. So when we look to connect this to literacy, obviously decoding and encoding are very much rooted in understanding of the phonology of the English language. And layered on top of that becomes this memory and retrieval component. So we have our phonological working memory, which is this short-term storage that we use to keep our phoneme information present, right? And many times we're holding it so that we can manipulate it, so that we can think about the word we're trying to spell and play around with the sounds we're thinking of, okay? And so one of the things that makes the English language challenging and less transparent than some other languages is this idea of spelling options, right? So if I say to you, what are all the, I'm thinking of a word, I put a word on there. If I tell you spellstration, okay, you're gonna think about all the different ways that you could encode or think about, I'm hearing the word s. What are my choices for s? Could be an S, could be a C. Oh, I'm hearing t, what are my options to, what graphemes can I use to represent that? Shun, we often teach as a unit. Well, there's two options for shun. Which one am I using? A, long A has a lot of options to spell and encode. So that's why you have to hold in that phonological working memory this information so that you can manipulate it, change it around, and figure out the spelling options that might be correct, right? So that's one of the reasons phonological working memory is so valuable. Also, when we're decoding, taking that image of the grapheme that's in front of me and being able to think about all of the sound options that might go with that, okay? And that also relies on longer term storage where we have to retrieve phonological information that has been taught, right? So if I say to a student, I look at these 3 letter tiles and I say, what is that letter's sound? And they're looking at the C, they need to retrieve that it says k and it says s, okay? So that has to deal with retrieving from their longer term store the phoneme that is associated with the grapheme. And then the A, if we're looking at a short A, like ah, right? They can look at the A and say that says ah, right? What else can it say? Well, it can say A, absolutely, right? So that's that process of taking these sounds that you have built, being able to hold them short term to manipulate them, then being able to store them long term where we can retrieve it. So that's a really important part of being a competent decoder and encoder. Research on phonology and how it relates to reading and spelling is long established. You can take a very deep dive back to some of the research that started in the 1970s, establishing that this phonological knowledge, this understanding of our sound-based system, are related to the development of reading and writing, and that establishing this strong foundational knowledge can contribute to improved reading and writing outcomes. And we see that reflected in, I pulled some of New York State's kindergarten standards, because that really had the most robust amount of phonological based standards. So understanding phonemes is one of the standards, and recognizing and being able to produce rhyming words. So you understand that words rhyme based on your auditory perception of sound. That is really an important part of rhyming. You can complete rhyming tasks fully auditorily. You can blend and segment syllables, right? So we can talk about at the level of the syllable, right? Baseball is baseball. Onset and rhymes, right? At comes together to be cat, right? Creating new words by manipulating phonemes. So I had kind of already talked about some of those examples. You know, if you say the word is pat and I say, instead of say it becomes pit. That's when we're manipulating. And then we move into decoding and then sound letter correspondence. When we're thinking about students that are multilingual, what is consistent across any phonologically based or phonics based language is that the same skills apply. That this idea of understanding the sound structure on which that language is built is a very important part of reading development. And that we need to, as we do more broadly with language in general for multilingual learners, we need to understand what those skills look like in their primary language, their L1. Because if there's a deficit at the L1 level, it will bleed into their second language. So by the same idea, if we have an English language learner who has a strong understanding of the phonemes and the phonological base of their primary language, it should support better skill development in their second language. And so what this says to me as a speech language pathologist and as somebody who thinks about assessment of skills, I think we need to make sure when our multilingual learners are being assessed, and they're being assessed in their native language as well as English, we need to make sure a robust analysis of their reading and spelling and how it relates to phonology has to be part of the plan, because it will tell us what their level of need is. Because if they have some gaps in their L1 understanding of phonology and how that relates to their printed language, that may cause even bigger barriers in teaching them those skills in English. So they may need to remediate some of those skills in their L1 and then try to transfer that to their L2. There was an interesting study done in 2005 that looked at if we took English language learning students and provided them truly explicit instruction in phonological tasks, and they did 45 minutes a day for 12 weeks, would these skills improve in their learning of spoken, written English? And they did. They showed a significant improvement in their ability to decode and encode in English. And so I think too often, especially when we have students that move past this sort of preschool, kindergarten, first grade level, we leave some of these phonological skills behind, particularly if we have a multilingual learner coming into the school at age 8, age 9, and we're teaching them how to read and write in English. We may skip the step of making sure they understand the phonology and understand the manipulation of sound and some of these skills. So I want to make sure that we're not skipping that simply because of their age or grade level, that we're making sure those foundational skills that have been well researched as an important part of the plan are established for them. So what are some things you can do to support some learners in your classrooms? Make sure that you make some time for phonologically based tasks. I think one of the big things with the clients that I have worked with is they tend to be very confused about the fact that we can talk about a letter's name and a letter's sound, and they're not the same thing, even if they're similar. Like the letter M has its sound in its name, but when we talk about that letter, that grapheme, when we show them that letter, we need to say, what's his name? Oh, it's M, that's right. What sound does an M make? Totally different things. A lot of decoding and encoding confusion comes from a lack of understanding of letter names and letter sounds. I also think it's important to talk about the sound structure explicitly. So for example, if you give them the word shoe, I might ask, how many letters are in the word shoe? Well, 4, but how many sounds? Sh, ooh, there's only 2 sounds in the word shoe. And that's a really important distinction, that there isn't a one-to-one. It's one of the things that makes English a little bit more challenging. There isn't a one-to-one correspondence between letter and sound. Some letters make multiple sounds, sometimes 2 letters combined or 3 letters combined to make one sound, J can be spelled DGE, right? So I think it's really important to talk about, yes, there's 4 letters, but how many sounds exist in that word? Blending, segmenting, deletion, and substitution. There's a lot of support for these skills as far as development of stronger encoding and decoding skills. So I think a lot of times I prefer to do these tasks verbally only, right? So if I say, what word am I saying? It, and see if they can blend that together. You can make that multisensory by sometimes having tools, any manipulatives where they can start with them spread apart and start to move them together as they blend the word. You can start at the syllable level. What word am I saying? Backpack. Okay. We can do some manipulation, substitution, deletion. I can say the word stop. Now say it without the s. A lot of kids like to, because they don't understand how letter sounds and the letters work, they'll say op. They will take the S and the T off as a unit. So that's a good time to bring in some of those manipulatives like blocks and say, I hear 4 sounds, op. What if I take this away? I think the other thing you can do, if I can kind of change one thing in some of the reading instruction that I've seen, is to make sure that when you're teaching students and when students are producing sounds, that they're clipping those sounds. So for some, especially for voiceless sounds. So if you have a voiced sound like a B says buh, it's going to naturally have a little bit of an I'm going to try not to exaggerate it. I'm going to say buh and try to make it as short and as clipped as possible. But if we take the T sound, T says t, it doesn't say ta. And I think a lot of times when we add that extra to our voiceless sounds, like t goes, we say it says ta, k says ka. Many times that really throws off their auditory perception of the vowel sound in that word, right? So I don't say that at home I have a cat, I say I have a cat, I say I have a cat. So I think it's really important to hold students to that standard so that they have a much cleaner perception on their phonology. As speech language pathologists, I also want to point out that our kids who have speech sound disorders and language impairments will likely struggle with these types of tasks. This is something where their inability to produce the speech sound correctly, their lack of overall phonological work with their speech, like if they're deleting final consonants, if they're voicing sounds that shouldn't be voiced, will bleed into their learning of literacy skills for sure. Kids with language impairments may struggle with understanding the directions of the task. And so always remember, the speech language pathologists in your schools are experts on phonology. They are phonology specialists. So if you need some support, especially if there are kids with speech and language deficits in your classroom, supporting them, don't be afraid to collaborate. That's it for me.
Okay, so I'm up next and I'll be talking about morphology. So we'll start with the definition. What is morphology? It's the system that governs the structure of words and the construction of word forms. Let's think about morphemes. What are morphemes? They're the smallest unit of meaning in spoken language. So when we think about that, basically what we're thinking about is the different parts that make up words, prefixes, suffixes, and root words. So for example, if we look at the word smallest, and I said how many morphemes does that word have? It has 2. It's got the root word small and the suffix est. Okay, so a little just review because it's probably been a bit since you've thought about this. So there's 2 types of morphemes. You can have free morphemes or bound morphemes. So free morphemes are just morphemes that are words by themselves and they can't be broken down any further. They can stand alone by themselves. So what that really means is free morphemes are root words. So for example, the word girl, right, or tall, those are all root words that can stand alone. So those are free morphemes. Bound morphemes then are morphemes that cannot be used alone. So what that really means is those are the affixes or the prefixes and suffixes, right? So an S at the end of the word, a prefix like re at the beginning, or suffix s. We can break those down even further and talk about 2 different kinds of bound morphemes. There's inflectional bound morphemes and derivational bound morphemes. So if you are thinking what is an inflectional morpheme, it just means that it does not adjust the part of speech or the base meaning of the word. So there's really a limited number of these and they're always suffixes, like the S at the end of the word girls is a inflectional morpheme. So it doesn't really change the meaning, it's still a noun, it doesn't change the part of speech. And so that's that. Derivational means that it does adjust the meaning of the root word and it may change the part of speech. These can be either prefixes or suffixes. So if you take the word right and you add a prefix to it, now you've got a very different word saying that you're rewriting something. Okay, we can get a little lost in the weeds there. I just wanted to provide that little kind of general information. Here's a fun fact for you. The longest word in the English dictionary is 45 letters long. So when I saw that, I thought, wow. Anybody want to try to say that? I don't. So I found this little video to help us say it.
Numino-ultramicroscopic silicovolcanoconiosis.
That's exactly how I would have said it.
Let's say it one more time.
Numino-ultramicroscopic silicovolcanoconiosis.
Okay, so if you just saw that word, you'd be like, what in the world does that mean, right? So how are we going to figure this out? We can break it down into all of its little parts. And so I've kind of done that on the slide, showing you, pneumo or pneumino means long, ultra means beyond, microscopic means small, and you can really attack that word and break it down as far as you can, and then come up with a general idea of what the meaning is. Lucky for us, we don't have a lot of words that are quite that complex. So when you're thinking in terms of literacy connections, there's a direct link between morphological awareness and reading and writing proficiency. So what has been researched and proven is that direct instruction in morphology leads to increased sight word recognition and increased decoding abilities, which then lead to improved reading fluency and comprehension. So if you're wondering, is this important? Do I need to teach morphology? Do I need to teach prefixes and suffixes? Yes, students need to be taught that directly and explicitly. Just like phonology, it's not something that they're just going to pick up on their own. They really need to be taught it really directly. So it is in the learning standards, language standard 4, as early as kindergarten. The actual language standard says to determine or clarify the meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words and phrases by using context clues, analyzing meaningful word parts, and consulting general and specialized reference materials. So the key to us there really is analyzing meaningful word parts, right? So in the early grades, kindergarten through 3rd grade, you're really focusing on those inflectional and derivational morphemes, really thinking about the prefixes and suffixes and how they affect the root words. In grades 4 to 8, you get a little bit more in depth and you look at, you start to look at Latin and Greek etymologies, thinking about the base words and how things play together. And you see a lot of those in content areas, specifically science and math. And then in the high school grades, you get even more in depth to really look at independent etymological investigations. So all of this is just to say that if a student at any level is missing this instruction, it will negatively impact their reading and writing. So what is the best way to teach morphology? Not through just rote memorization of prefixes and suffixes and base words. They do need to learn, students do need to learn, of course, what some prefixes mean and what some suffixes mean in order to be able to apply that. So that's where you need to then really encourage your students to expand their knowledge and think about the word chunks and help them figure out how to break down words, to construct and deconstruct word meanings when they come across an unfamiliar word in a text that they're reading. Here's just an example. If you think of the Latin root port, that means to carry. Look at all of the words here that we can get when we add different prefixes and suffixes, right? So in the first box, it's showing you words like portable, portage, portability, ported, porteur. And then the next box shows you, okay, now guess what? We can add prefixes there, but then we can also add on suffixes. And oh, a lot of the suffixes are the same as they were in that first box, right? So this could be a fun little exercise that you could do with some older students to kind of see how many words can they build or construct from root words and then different prefixes and suffixes that they know. In terms of multilingual considerations, so again, explicit instruction is needed for English language learners, and that will lead to their improved reading comprehension when they're learning to read in English. There are some barriers to this. So the barriers being that teachers need to have a greater understanding of morphology in order to teach it really directly and really clearly to English language learners. And they also need better access to curricular materials to support that. To support those English language learners, teachers should provide some demonstrations on the ways that English is different from the student's home language. So one example of this is that many other languages other than English have something called infixes. So this was something that I was like, what's an infix? We don't have that. It's an affix in the middle of a word. So here's a little example. In English, we write the word to in front of a verb to create the infinitive to write. And then in the Tagalog language, there's an infix that's inserted into the middle of the word to write, and it forms a completely different word. So teachers having that knowledge and understanding how to explain the differences between English and the home language is a huge, huge key for English language learners. A majority of our English language learners in classrooms in the United States are Spanish speaking. So Spanish is a Romance language, meaning that Latin is at its base, right? So therefore, some of the students who speak Spanish and are coming into our classrooms may know some Latin-based morphemes. So they may already have some of this knowledge, and then you can just kind of build on it and show similarities and differences between English and Spanish. So here's just, again, some more examples. The English word different, and then the Spanish Counterpart comes from the Latin root that means to set apart. English suffixes have kind of Spanish counterpart suffixes to create words that you can make that correlation for. So really, the key to just remember with English language learners is that they need this explicit teaching in English and how morphology plays a part. That's super convenient because the key to teaching morphology to all students is through explicit instruction, right? So given the importance that morphological knowledge has on reading comprehension for all students, teachers must provide that systematic and explicit morphological instruction. So just like Melissa just said, you need to make some time to teach phonology. Likewise, there needs to be time devoted just to morphology as well. Here's just a few examples of some things that I found of ways that you can bring this into your classrooms, depending on what level you teach at, of course. But I know a lot of classrooms have sight word walls, or now some classrooms are getting sound walls, which are awesome. So why not create a morpheme wall where you can have prefixes, root words, suffixes. Anytime you can color code things like they've done here, just provides a little extra multisensory knowledge that students can tap into. So I love that idea. Using color-coded graphic organizers to separate prefixes, root words, and suffixes. If you're working with the younger ones, doing something fun and creative, like these little ceiling spiders I thought were so cute, taking the root and seeing how many words we can make shooting off of that root word. These little prefix pockets. I found a million actually adorable ideas just with a really quick Pinterest search. So Pinterest is your friend. Be creative, have fun, and remember that speech language pathologists in your schools can also be a really good support for this. So if you're teaching a unit, it would be another good time to have your SLP collaborate with you in your classroom to support this morphology instruction.
It is my turn, and I'm going to be talking about semantics. And what I love about what we've talked about so far is all of the topics are connected. So Melissa talked about phonology, Grace talked about morphology. I'm going to be talking about semantics. And then later, Caitlin will talk about syntax and pragmatics. But even like with these first two parts, there's so many connections to what I'm going to say about vocabulary. And I think that is a really important thing to remember as you work with students in your classrooms, and especially English language learners, students who have special education needs, but all your students, and that language is connected across the board, and the oral language part serves as a foundation for written language. So when we think about semantics, probably the first word that comes to mind is going to be vocabulary. And on the surface, we might think about receptive and expressive vocabulary. And even like within receptive and expressive vocabulary, receptive vocabulary is your understanding, your comprehension of a word. So at a very basic level, asking a student to point to the picture that goes with the word that you say. So it's not a speaking test, it's an identification task. Expressive vocabulary would be just the opposite, where you would show a student a picture and ask them to tell you the name of that picture. So that would be a spoken task, your expressive vocabulary. But there's a lot more to vocabulary than just being able to identify a picture related to a word or to name a picture. And I'm just thinking of the word that Grace shared with us and Elmo, and that would be a really big word for Elmo. Okay, so ASHA in their practice portal, in Language in Brief, which we'll look at, that whole visual, picture of language in brief, but they define semantics as the meaning of words and word combinations. That's a really kind of vague definition, a very broad definition, perhaps is a better word. But when we think of semantics and the meaning of words, we want to think that it includes word knowledge. So more than just being able to name something, but your knowledge of that word. And when I think of word knowledge, I think of maybe a semantic map. So if you ask yourself, well, what do I think of when I think of cat? And at different age levels, that image is going to be different. Those concepts are going to be different, but a child, a young child, a toddler might think of their pet cat and that it, maybe its name, that it's furry. Older student who's taking classes in science or biology may have broader, deeper concepts of what a cat is, so what cat means. So when we think of word knowledge, when we think of semantics, we want to think of word knowledge, and that knowledge of a word is stored in our brain, and it's what helps us retrieve that word when we see a picture of a cat and all the things associated with it. We have a vocabulary that we have a speaking, we have a listening, we have a reading, and we have a writing vocabulary. So our speaking vocabulary is probably the most casual of our vocabularies, especially, well, it depends on who we're talking to, but between friends, our speaking vocabulary is much different, or it should be much different than our vocabulary that we use when we're speaking to adults or authority figures. We have a listening vocabulary, so the words that we understand. We have a reading vocabulary, the words that we understand when we're interacting with text. And then we have a writing vocabulary, the words we use when we're writing narratives, expository. And our writing vocabulary is probably going to be a lot more sophisticated than our speaking vocabulary because our written language is more formal. Semantics, or our understanding of words, the meaning of words, is influenced by our world knowledge. So how many different experiences we have in life in general. It's influenced by our exposure to words, and our exposure to words, especially starting at a very young age, comes through shared book reading, listening to our parents talk, having parents and caregivers who use an enriched vocabulary. And children also get that enriched vocabulary through literacy and literature and shared book reading. Semantics is also influenced by the other domains of language and in terms of form, content, and use. So if we look at this language in brief picture from the ASHA practice portal, it shows how spoken and written language share properties across listening, speaking, reading, and writing in all of the domains of language, in phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And for me, and like my topic, semantics, I think that is probably the least descriptive part of this image, but we can see that even in pragmatics, there is semantics, there's vocabulary involved. So understanding social aspects of social language and conversational exchanges includes like knowing what the different WH question words mean, knowing what why means, knowing what who means. We think of speaking in pragmatics.